So it's no secret that Borderlands 4 has been looking better and better with each new showcase and generally has a very positive sentiment around it. And me personally, I'm super excited for it. I have been really liking a majority of the information we've been getting for the launch of Borderlands 4, but that doesn't mean there can't be some pretty big issues once the game is actually released. So I wanted to go over the top 5 possible issues I could see with Borderlands 4 once it's actually released and in our hands. And at number 5, we have balance. And I think balance is actually a much bigger deal than a lot of people think. And for whatever reason in the Borderlands community, there is a lot of people completely opposed to pretty much any balancing and more specifically any nerfing. If you go back to Borderlands 3, we had some pretty big nerfs early on in Borderlands 3. And while I think some of those nerfs were too heavy-handed, I think the general direction was good because the things that were nerfing were so incredibly overpowered. That's all anybody would be using if they didn't nerf them. And that to me is a massive issue. One of the biggest things for me, especially for RPGs and really loot-driven games, is keeping the difficulty and keeping the challenge of the game while also being able to create builds that feel really strong. Because if I'm creating builds and they just steamroll over everything at all times, what's really the point of creating super strong builds? I want to keep trying to make builds better and better and create the coolest and strongest builds possible to actually have something that's difficult and challenging to go put those builds up against. And with Borderlands 4 having so many new systems and so much more complex RPG mechanics, balance can really become an issue. And this goes for just the campaign, the general balance of going through that and the player progression, and then more specifically when getting into the end game. But the developers seem like they're actually on this because we have actually had some information from developers specifically saying that they want you to feel like a badass, they want you to be able to create a bunch of builds, but if there are big outliers, specifically at the high end where something feels too strong, like you'll always have to use it, then that just needs nerfed. And I very much agree with that. Things should be nerfed that are too strong because that means you're just going to use those. And then if they try to add in more difficulties or more challenging content, they kind of have to balance it based around the super high end of stuff. So nerfing those down, but also buffing up the weak stuff is what I'm really hoping for Borderlands 4. And at number 4, we have something that isn't specific to Borderlands, but bugs and performance. Having really bad performance or the game being super buggy can just make the game not super fun to play for pretty much everybody. You go back to Borderlands 3, there was some performance issues, especially if you were on consoles, and there was a good amount of bugs for everybody. And even though a lot of those weren't completely game breaking, there was still a lot of bugs and a lot of people still have a sour taste in their mouth because the game wasn't super polished on launch. But I will say this is something we just have to wait until the game is launched to actually feel for ourselves, because bug fixing, polishing, and getting better performance is really something that is done much more heavily at the end of development. So right now they're probably focusing on bugs and on performance going into the launch. So there can be pretty big changes in those last few months or last 6 months in this department. And I also will say with all of these public playtests now, it seems like the performance, specifically on PC, has been really good, or at least generally pretty good. So it does seem like performance, at least on decent PCs, is seeming to be pretty good, because when you're months and months out and the playtests already have pretty decent performance, that bodes well for the performance side, but we really need to see how buggy the game is going to be. And these really are things that just putting more work into the game fixes, because this isn't like big design issues or balancing issues that could take more skill. This is really just taking the time to polish up the game and make it run smoother. And at number 3, we have difficulty. And there's multiple trains of thought with this, because more specifically, you have the campaign difficulty and going through that and leveling up. Then you have the end game difficulty that can go into thousands of hours down the road. Now, we do know that specifically with grouping up, that players will be able to have a different difficulty. So let's say you're going through the campaign. One person could be on easy, the other person could be on hard, and it should scale correctly for either one of you, which I don't know exactly how that's going going to work, because it would generally seem that the player that's on easier difficulty would have an easier time so they could kill things more easily. But it is pretty cool that they're trying to make a system like that work. But past that, we really don't know how the difficulty is going to work into the end game. It's seeming like for the campaign, there's just going to be like easy and normal, maybe like a hard difficulty or something, but we don't really know how the difficulty is going to be going into the end game. We know they're not going to have mayhem modifiers like Borderlands 3. Instead, that's kind of being added into the affix system. They're basically doing the exact same thing that ARPGs do, where more difficult enemies like elites and mini bosses can have essentially modifiers on them, which are basically like affixes that can give them different powers and stuff, which I think is much better than having the mayhem modifiers like we got in Borderlands 3. But we don't know what the difficulty systems are going to be on top of that for the end game. And we know Borderlands 4 is being completely developed with end game in mind, and it's going to be the biggest end game of any Borderlands game. So there's going to have to be different difficulties or different difficulty systems. And depending on how this is balanced and how this plays out, it could be a really big issue for the game, because there's actually two ways this could be really bad. First off, it's just being way too easy. That takes a lot of the fun out of the game for a lot of players, especially with a loot game that's really heavily focused on creating all these crazy builds. If everything just gets killed super easily with not even having like a super strong build, then going and hunting for all of this more unique and better loot doesn't really serve a purpose anymore. So a lot of people just stop playing much earlier in. But then you also have the flip side where the game could be way too difficult, and this can be a much bigger issue if these higher difficulties give a lot more loot or better loot. But I do think being much easier is actually a worse possibility than being too hard. But being way too hard can still also be an issue. So I do really hope they're taking more inspiration from ARPGs and having a bunch of different difficulty systems that allows you to kind of tailor the difficulty of where you're at in your build and what you want to do. Because if I say go to Diablo 4, I could just change the difficulty if my build isn't strong enough. I won't get, say, as much loot or as much gold or experience, but I'll still be able to go farm any of the items in the game. And that's something I definitely want for Borderlands 4 as well. And at number 2, we have endgame content, and more specifically, how much endgame content is going to be on launch and the variety of content we're going to have to go play in and farm. Because realistically, it's 2025. This is going to be in competition with a lot of other games, and even more specifically, a lot of other loot-focused games. There needs to be a good amount of endgame content, and there needs to be a good variety of endgame content with a lot of different systems to go partake in and farm loot in. Realistically, going to order Borderlands games, just redoing a lot of the stuff you do in the campaign just doesn't really cut it anymore as an end game. Now, based upon the information we've gotten from developers, it seems that Borderlands 4 was specifically built with endgame in mind. It was balanced with endgame in mind. They built a lot of systems with endgame in mind, and they have said that Borderlands 4 will have much more endgame than any previous Borderlands game has had. So that all bodes pretty well for the endgame, but there could still be issues with not having enough variation in the content, with still not having enough endgame content just in general. Because I do think as the years have gone by, players have just gotten much more efficient, players min-max a lot more, and players are generally more endgame and performance driven than we used to be with like the older Borderlands games. So I do think this is going to play a much bigger role in the long-term success of Borderlands 4 than it has with any previous Borderlands game. So I just want a bunch of different systems in the endgame and just a lot of different content. And not only on launch, but how quickly we end up getting the new DLC and new content will also play a pretty big role in this. Because if there's not enough endgame content, but we get like a new piece of content or a new DLC pretty quickly after the launch of the game, even if it's one of the smaller pieces of content, that can still bode really well for the future of the game. But at number 1, we have Borderlands 4 just being too grindy. And I think this one is going to take the most finesse to make feel good, but because of some of the new systems, there's a possibility that Borderlands 4 is just going to be very grindy. And more specifically, the new licensed parts system for weapons and a lot of the gear in the game, because there's so much more randomness within the systems in Borderlands 4, specifically with that weapons parts system, that there's the possibility that you'll just have to farm excessive amounts of time to get, say, the weapon rolls you actually want. Now, in some ways, these grinds are actually good. If they do a good job of balancing the game where getting a specific weapon you want without the absolute optimal rolls is still very good, then having the absolute min-maxed best in slot rolls being much more rare could generally not be an issue. But if we're getting into 1 in like 100,000 chance of getting the actual item roll you want, or like 1 in millions chance of getting like a class mod with the specific rolls you want, that's when it just becomes too big of an issue, because it should be grindy to get the absolute best rolls you can possibly get, but it shouldn't feel like it's literally impossible to get there like some items have been in previous Borderlands games. And again, I do think this is the thing that's going to take the most finesse to feel good. Hopefully they keep balancing this after the launch of the game, because while I think this can be an issue, I am super excited to put in just hundreds or thousands of hours into farming legendary items and just seeing the ridiculous rolls you can get. But that's 5 of the biggest issues I can see going into the launch of Borderlands 4. And while these can be potential issues, most of the things I've seen for Borderlands 4 so far has made me just more and more excited for the game. A lot of the stuff that was bad about Borderlands 3 has seemingly been fixed going into Borderlands 4, and I'm liking a majority of the things I'm seeing, especially Borderlands 4 taking more inspiration from ARPGs and just having a lot more interesting and complex RPG systems. The much bigger skill trees, the much crazier possibilities with weapons, going into things like gear sets when we get more into the end game. All of that stuff is super exciting for me and some of the things I'm most excited for. And also them developing the game around endgame and hopefully having a ton of endgame content on release. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.